there was a post vision of India, there were many visions of India, of varying Rajaji vision of India, of varying degrees of rootedness. But we continued with the old system that was colonial structure, with grafting of socialism borrowed from the West again. And it didn't change with Indira, who hugged the Soviets closer. It didn't change with 1991 either. The reforms were brought in by the IMF. Manmohan happened to be in place, and they had made huge blunders in 1987. The IMF, this year in the IMF, I gave them a very hard time, and of course I'm not particularly popular there. And I asked them, why is it that the same crisis in 1987 and now evokes two separate responses? One happened in ASEAN, and they said austerity. One happens in Europe, and they say deficit funding, because we can't afford a recession. Is that because the IMF is a European club run by Frenchmen and now a French woman? And people of brown and black and yellow skin are meant to open doors, write the memos, and serve tea? Until a few years ago, Belgium had more voting rights than China. This is a joke. This is an absolute joke. Now, of course, the point is that the IMF had made massive mistakes in 87. They wanted to atone in 1991. India gave them an opportunity, and they played softly, and we adopted it. And whilst we have phones from Korea and cars from Germany and sugar water called Coca-Cola, we have not been able to come up with our own paradigms. There has been a loss of culture. Even today, if you speak English, you're intelligent and smart and educated. It happens with my mother. She's a Hindi speaker. If she calls anyone in Delhi, especially in an institution, a bank or anything, she's treated like a peasant. She studied Sanskrit and Hindi. That's a pretty tough thing to study. That's a pretty decent education. But someone who speaks English, no matter how badly, especially in that fast-paced Delhi or Mumbai accent, is deemed to be a person of higher status. And so we still haven't got over our fixation with language. Look at the Filmfare Awards. And the reason I bring it up again and again is that the people who make their millions and multi-millions do it through Hindi cinema or Urdu cinema. It's Hindi, Urdu, indistinguishable. It's watched equally in Pakistan and the rest of Central Asia. But the point is, the awards are always in English. It's like, if you really can't speak the vernacular in which you're making your money, then you might as well make films in English. And I don't mean just Hindi or Urdu. I mean, all vernacular is in peril. Look at Bangla. I'm sure there are Bangla speakers here. What has happened to Bangla literature today? I did my class 12th from Calcutta. Bengal was the forerunner of much that transpired later in India, whether it is Raja Ram Mohan Roy and his reforms, or whether it's Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. Bengal lit the torch that the rest of the country carried forward. The Indian Renaissance began in Bengal, but today Bengal is an intellectual desert. It breaks my heart. So there has been a decline of the vernacular, including Tamil, which is the oldest Indian language, oldest existing Indian language. So that is the backstory so far. And now I'll try to enunciate what I believe is my vision and hope for the future. So one of the great positive things that are happening, this is so much a heavy legacy, but one of the great positive things that are happening is that Indians are doing better. Certain values we have, for instance, I was talking to two people here, both of them professors, and their children are both in California, one in Walnut Creek and one in Mountain View. This is basically the epicenter of modern day technological innovation. And because there is a very strong stress on education, because there is this phenomenal work ethic, at least amongst the middle class, we are producing people who are becoming world beaters. And this is happening in a whole range of fields, whether it is string theory in physics, or it is surgery, or it is pharmaceutical research. I have friends in all kinds of fields who are doing absolutely exceptional work. So Indians are rising in professional and intellectual eminence globally. That is a fact. What is also happening is that Indians are, and let me finish with the implications of the first. When that starts to happen, your self-esteem starts going up. Because when you realize you can punch with the best and roll with their punches, you realize that for all the pummeling, for all our foibles and warts, there is something intrinsic that is phenomenally pliable and phenomenally phenomenal about our civilization and our culture and our identity over time. Maybe not immediately, generation by generation starts improving. I mean, on a personal note, I don't think my father's generation would have taken the battle to The Economist the way I have chosen to. When people ask me, they say, who's your target? I say, The Economist. And they say, oh, but they've been around since 1843. And I said, precisely. Have you seen how many pages is Middle East and North Africa? 2. How many pages is Europe? How many pages is South and Central Asia? 2. And it's always told from this moralistic British perspective. America should do this and India should do that, and covers like hit him hard with the photo of Assad. An argument for the Iraq war not too long ago. Let's invade Iraq. And for, kicking out Saddam and bringing democracy, conveniently forgetting an ally called Saudi Arabia that is far from democratic. And as Indians, how can we forget that from 1843 to 1947, The Economist opposed India's independence? Because of course we needed British tutelage. We weren't ready for independence. We needed their protection. Defense, strategic, otherwise, as Churchill put it, an army of German janissaries would have taken us over. So, and the personal note is very simply this, that I don't think if I'd been born a generation ago, I would have had the swagger to do that. That has come because I saw my cousins do well, become professors, do well in the MITs and the Harvards, etc. And I thought, there's no difference. So the reverence was lost. Not consciously, but subconsciously. And there are people like me who have done much better, and they have blazed paths and succeeded much more. So that means that our narrative and all of eminence, or all of a civilizational eminence, I believe, depends on the control of narrative. And there's this proverb that if the lions had until the lions have their own historians, the hunt will be glamorized. And so the resting back of the narrative will begin as Indians do better. Second, Indians are returning to their homeland, bringing in dynamism and professionalism. I was just told about an Indian cell phone. Now I know a lot about new trends in India. I know about friends who've come back and set up companies in all kinds of technological ventures, but remind me, what was the name of the phone? Macromax. Macromax is a classic example of an Indian product challenging all the big and heavy hitters and pushing someone like Apple to number 3. And so professional practices will improve. People will bring, because there are certain things, as a culture, we don't have as much efficiency. The Germans, if they say something begins at 12 noon, it begins at 12 noon. Their trains run to time. And when you go out and you see, then you discover processes. Okay, how do their trains run on time? They have X, Y, Z process. So you start, how do they do project management? You start learning, and you bring some of that back. And you also bring back not just professional practices, but technological know-how and knowledge. Some of it is intangible and some of it is tangible. For instance, I didn't know before I set this up, oh, you should get the trademark. That's an intangible knowledge. I haven't learned any technology per se. No, I've learned about it, but not any technology. But now I know the little things which I didn't if I was here. So you bring that back, when Indians come back, even to visit, they bring back that knowledge, and that knowledge transfer begins, that economic dynamism increases, and confidence increases. Third, I do believe firmly and fervently that new paradigms have to come from this country. And I can't pinpoint exact pieces of evidence as a trend, but when I hear the discourse and the dissatisfaction and the questioning, especially amongst the young, of existing paradigms, especially those born after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, when I hear that, I have faith. And here's why. Well, communism is dead. The reason it is dead is it was an arbitrary ideology with no regard to history, imposed by a central bureaucracy. And it was imposed by a tiny elite on the basis of repression. So abject worship of Marx, like our communists, is going to go nowhere, because Marx was a great political philosopher in the context of his time. The operative words are, in the context of his time. The most brilliant analysis of the weaknesses of 19th century industrialization and the capital system comes from Marx. Having said that, a large part of the world is now living in a post-industrial economy. There is no proletariat in the US. There are no jobs. The jobs have gone to China. You're either a waiter at Starbucks or a restaurant, or a coder in Google, in which case you're living in La La Land because you're having free juice and free food, and your parents can have free food. So the old paradigm has gone. And so what do? The new paradigm that came out after 1991, the arrogance of the end of history, Francis Fukuyama, a man whom I've met and a man who's brilliant, and who actually now is questioning his thesis. But at that time, the belief that American-style democracy was the future, that is in shambles, because it didn't confront existing problems like boundaries in the wrong places. How can you have American-style democracy when the whole of the Middle East is living off the Sykes-Picot paradigm, not to mention the Balfour Declaration? The slight problem, the lines were drawn in 1916 and 1917 and don't correspond to daily realities. So politically, that model doesn't make sense. Economically, the finance capitalism model is on life support. It is being kept up, propped up by two things: by deficit spending on the part of the governments and by unprecedented monetary easing. But this cannot last, because this is leading to an appreciation of asset values, boosting inequality, especially wealth inequality. You can make an intellectual argument for income inequality. It's impossible to make an argument for wealth inequality. Eventually, wealth inequality leads to a caste system, class system, and probably a caste system too, because some have and some don't. And quantitative easing, followed by the Federal Reserve, is pushing inflation to the emerging economies. And it's Indians and the Chinese and the Brazilians who are paying for it in terms of more expensive oil, more expensive vegetables, more expensive cereal, more expensive clothes. I mean, inflation all across the board. So the existing paradigms of the left, which came out of Europe and were fundamentally boosted by the Soviet Union and still practiced by Venezuela or Cuba, are dead. The model on the right, it's nearly dead. So we could take a view that we are caught between two worlds, one dead and the other powerless to be born, and get gloomy like Matthew Arnold, or view this as an opportunity to create a new paradigm. And I do believe that India, China, and many of the Asian countries which never had the nation-state system with a concentration of power in a bureaucracy, where things were free-flowing, where there was the guild, guild of merchants, where there was things, you came and went, and there was more, laissez-faire, because society per se was self-regulating in a way, is a better model, because the nation-state system came out of the absolutism of Europe. The 1618 to 1648, 30 years war is when the nation-state system is born. The Treaty of Westphalia, it's a particularly gruesome war. It's like the modern Syrian civil war. It's Protestant versus Catholic, that's how it begins, and then it becomes a pursuit of national interests. And Cardinal Richelieu realizes he doesn't want the Austro-Hungarian Empire to become too powerful. And while a nation-state system is born, which corresponds to one nation, meaning a people with a common race, religion, identity, yada yada, you can define it the way you like it, but some people who feel they are a people, based on some common element, language in the case of France, where power is really concentrated. And the state is all, and society per se is weakened. So the new paradigm will not be questioned in Europe, because that's worked too well for them. This new paradigm will be questioned here more than China, I believe, because we have such chaos and we are not doing terribly well. So we have the incentive and the push to question what's wrong. Fourth, I'm in Allahabad, Prayag. There's no running away from the fact that this is a spiritual land. The world's major religions are Hebraic and Gangetic. And as I said, if you're born in a more arid place, you tend to have a greater adherence to doctrine. Control of an oasis is a matter of life and death. So you do have a codification of doctrine in a holy book, whether it's a Quran, whether it's a Bible, whether it's Torah, which is not one book, but it's a series of books. Codification happens. It's nothing to do with that religion per se, in my opinion. It's to do with the geography in which it is born. And the genius of our culture is we accept that what is true for one is not necessarily true for another. There is a looseness with definition. There is an acceptance of ambiguity. What Keats called negative capability. Note, we never use the word negative. You don't. There is a deep belief in India that life at its essence is too complex to be fully captured by any doctrine. And that, I think, is fundamentally the reason we came up with the idea of the zero. This imagination that there was somethingness in nothingness. That is the Indian genius. And Islam and Christianity that have come to India are very different to the way they are practiced elsewhere. How many Christians do you find protesting outside an abortion clinic and sending threats to doctors? I think all Christian hospitals here perform abortions. They don't encourage it, But there is this tolerance. There isn't this crazy adherence to dogma that I see in the US. This opposition of evolution, this Jesus is my favorite philosopher, this wearing of your religion on your sleeve, which a large section of the population does. We don't have that amongst Indian Christians. We have Professor Farooqi. You know, he will tell you all about India's great mystic traditions. India's great musicians, Bismillah Khan, you know, used to perform in front of the temples. And so there is a syncretism in the Indian soil, maybe because it's so fertile that, you know, whatever religion comes here relaxes, eases out. So I personally believe that we cannot suddenly turn into a civilization that is chasing brand names like China. You know, China had a cultural revolution, and now everyone's running after Christian Dior and Christianity. We don't want to forget who we are, because we have to know who we are to figure out where we are going. And for me, the loss of Chinese culture is tragic. I mean, the loss of Confucianism, Taoism, that's human heritage. It's tragic. And so for us to remember that, and to remember the best of that, to retain our philosophical heritage is key. So finally, the final point, we have to make our peace with history. And by that I mean, there are many narratives here. And I'll not beat around the bush. I will say something very simply. There was one evening in London where I had a profound insight. There was a Pakistani chap, obviously from a big feudal landowning family in Punjab. They invited me out for drinks, a very fancy bottle of wine. We started talk about history, identity, this, that, idea of Pakistan. And he said something. He said, "Sir, सोचिए, sovereignty तो हमारे मुगलों के हाथ से अंग्रेजों के हाथ गई, तो हमारे पास वापस आनी चाहिए थी ना?" So we have to have that empathy to understand where, let's say, not necessarily the Indian Islamic elite, but the Pakistani elite comes from. Because there were many visions of Pakistan. There was this middle-class idea, Jinnah's idea, who was Shia, and his soul would be burning right now at the thought of Shias getting slaughtered in Karachi. Doctors are getting killed, lawyers are getting killed, teachers are getting killed. There's influx of Wahhabi money which is creating intolerance in Pakistan. There's civil strife. But the idea, one was the middle-class idea of a professional Pakistan, like a modern-day Israel. The kind of idea that General Aziz talks about. If you listen to his interviews, he's the elder brother of Shaukat Aziz, who's in the Atlantic Foundation in Washington, D.C., a brilliant guy, brilliant fellow. The Pakistani generals are much sharper on average than ours, unsurprisingly. And so that was one idea of a professional, class-dominated Pakistan. There was the idea of religious Pakistan too, right? There was the idea of the patrician upper classes like Nawab Salimullah, who began the Muslim League under the patronage of Lord Curzon. And we have to remember that the Muslim narrative of history is going to be different than the Brahmin narrative of history, which is going to be different to the Dalit narrative of history, which is going to be different to the Rajput narrative of history. This is just in the north.